Having never left the garage since the day we bought it, this has been a long time coming. As today, the little car finally sees some daylight. Put simply, our GT6 has been through a lot. What started 7 years ago as fixing a botched restoration has scope creeped into something else entirely. And call it a Restomod or hot rod if you like, but regardless of semantics, it's been a great learning experience and there's still tons left to do. Episode 17 saw the creation of some custom mounts for the all-aluminum LS4. And last time, we rounded those off with one more for the transmission. We were going to use an off-the-shelf part this time around, but, well, of course, nothing's that easy. Anyway, even OE manufacturers will acknowledge that every solution still usually has a compromise. And this is no different. It will pose a slight inconvenience with exhaust routing later on, but we have a plan that should work out pretty well, and I think you're gonna like it. There's a bunch of stuff we need to take care of today though, so enough catch up, let's get on with it. All right, I've got a list and a will to use it. So let's start the day off with the pilot bearing. This little bearing rides in the back of the crankshaft and locates the nose of the transmission's input shaft. It's actually really crucial, as without it, the transmission and clutch will fail in short order. The issue we face is our T5's input shaft diameter is larger than what GM uses, meaning a GM bearing will either need the center board out, or the input shaft will need to be turned down. We'd like to leave the transmission alone, so the first option is the clear winner. Except it won't work either. Let's not get ahead of ourselves though. GM designed the LS crankshaft with provisions for two different styles of pilot bearings. A large one that lives here, and a smaller one that lives here. Pretty handy. We need the smaller variety as it sits further inside the crank and will allow us to run our very long late model T5 input shaft. But the issue is there is no inner race on this version to machine out. It's just rollers that ride directly on the input shaft. And that's no bueno. We could try to locate a bearing that fits our input shaft and adapt it or the crankshaft to fit, but of course we're not going to do that either because there is a much simpler solution. This is a pilot bushing from an early LS1 car. It's a direct fit for our crankshaft, and being a solid chunk of sintered bronze, the inner bore can be machined without issue. So that's exactly what happened. Our friend kindly took around 70 thou off the inner diameter, leaving us with 3.5 thou clearance as it was originally designed to run. So, problem solved. We really need to get a mini lathe. There are many varying opinions on bushings versus bearings, and I certainly don't have much first-hand experience to go by. But keep in mind that there are much less moving parts in a bushing, so it could technically last longer in theory. Ultimately, many cars have used bushings over the years, so I'd say we're good to go. Now, from factory, the LS4 didn't have a pilot bushing per se, but it did have something quite similar, which supported the automatic transmission's torque converter. And guess what? It's in our way. After trying to remove it with a homemade puller, we came to our senses and grabbed a real one, which got the job done in a matter of seconds. As the saying goes, it really pays to have the right 3-jaw pilot bushing puller tool. Or however that goes. Last-minute measurements can verify how far into the crankshaft we need to install the bushing, and it gets driven home with a socket, extension, and a big old hammer. There's supposed to be a 0.5 to 1 thou interference fit in the crank, meaning the bushing actually crushes slightly when you install it. But it certainly took more than a little effort to install ours, which tells us something isn't quite right. With a little digging, it turns out these aftermarket bushings are quite often a bit oversized, and to install them, they must be crushed more than usual. This is of no real consequence, other than our 3.5 thou clearance for the transmission shaft is now gone. Yay us. So, although not ideal by any means, a couple of light passes with a Dremel and one of these little sanding wheels removed just enough material that we now seem to be golden. I didn't have an inside mic or even a set of telescoping gauges when we did this, but now I do. So we'll double check that I didn't just ruin the bushing when it all goes together for final assembly. Never in my life did I think seeing two components turn individually would make my day, but it just did. And with that, every single main component of the engine and transmission package has been sorted. All within a tight budget, may I add. So let's celebrate by slapping it back in the car. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, subscribe, tell a friend, and hit that like button so YouTube knows that we're doing cool stuff. Ever since episode 16, the front suspension hasn't been bearing any of the car's weight, as a little stack of scrap under the cradle was taking care of that instead. But with the addition of these little pieces of angle iron, that scrap stack is now redundant, and for the very first time ever, the entire car is actually resting on its own new wheels and frame, which is awesome. It's taken us a couple of years from starting down this Restomod path to get to this point, but to see it all together finally, and actually standing free with no supports, is a pinnacle moment. So much so that we need to take a minute and roll it outside. I mean, dude, it's even car-like. I just can't handle it. Two things to point out, though. That spoiler is just a profile and an idea. That we're really not sure we like. Do you? Let us know in the comments. Also, the steering rack, which is just tacked in place, remember, accidentally got knocked off some time ago and was never really put back correctly. It bothers me every time I look at it, but it's been left like this as penance and to help me overcome my OCD. Thankfully, it'll be corrected before final welding. Now, as much as seeing the garage empty and the car outside is beautiful and mind-boggling, we do need to get back to work by sorting out the rear toe links. This contraption mounts to the center of our C4 Corvette differential and guides the rear uprights as the suspension articulates. Being completely untouched, though, means, of course, it's all too wide for the car. So let's mark up the ends for trimming with the grinder. This ended up removing most of the threaded area as it happens, so we need to quickly tap some more and follow up by screwing on the tie rod ends. One of the old ends was bent, so we bought a new one, and of course it's different. I guess we'll add that to our wish list for later and jot down another mark for my OCD testing. To the untrained eye, that may look like an awful lot of material was removed, but fear not, we took our measurements very carefully, as imagine if too much was cut off. That will be terrible. Yeah, not quite sure how we managed it, but that was perhaps a bit too much removal. I suppose we could just weld a nut onto each end and pretend like it never happened, or maybe some completely remade links are in order. I'll have to think on that, but at least this gets things taken care of for now. Now, looking ahead at what's next, honestly, we're going to need to work under the car quite a lot, and although our jack can lift reasonably high, I don't really trust axle stands as a long-term solution, so we need a better one. This is said better solution, minus some assembly. And I don't mean to brag or anything, but we've got 16 2x3s and almost a liter of gas. Just saying. You may be wondering at this point, in whose twisted mind is wood a better method of supporting a car than axle stands? And it's a fair point that will become more evident as we continue. First off, though, let's chop these into some 10 and 14-inch pieces. all was going quite well. Right up until we noticed we may have misjudged things a tiny bit.
And you don't need 16.
8 would have been
8
fine.
would do. Yeah, slightly overestimated. So if you want another set of axle stands, $200, you know, they're yours.
200.
No matter, the excess just means we can go a little higher, because more height is more better. Spiffy. It sure makes the car look a lot bigger than it really is though, and I was just nicely getting used to seeing it at ground level. The single car garage working environment has been fun since the beginning, but we never wanted to let the lack of space limit our imaginations, and I think you have to agree we've successfully done that. It is so cool finally being able to see under here, as all that hard work on the frame is now clearly visible and ties together pretty nicely. Nothing hangs below the main rails, and on the whole, everything just exudes a sense of durability about it, which I could not say about the original parts. You can also finally get a better idea as to how much room there is above the engine with the hood on, as some people have expressed some concern about this. Well, rest easy. There's actually quite a lot. All personal differences aside, you gotta admit these LS engines are super compact for what they are. Now, this extra working room under here is going to be incredibly helpful as we head into the next step, which is some body mounts. While a little underexposed, the corners here need some wedge-shaped pieces to allow use of the original body mounts just visible here and here. Now, keep in mind that as we're not using the mounts we made way back in episode 11, these new ones are going to be the only points aligning the body and frame until the rest get fabricated. So before we let loose with a grinder, let's take a moment to make darn sure we've got the body where we actually need it. If you remember, there was a lot done to the shell, and we know full well that none of it is a reliable reference to work off. So side to side and fore to aft fitment of the tires in the fenders is where we'll concentrate our attention. It was finicky. It took ages, but honestly, I can't complain about the outcome. We also tried to use some shims to get the car leveled out, or at least as close to level as we can with our equipment. Getting back to the new mounts though, they start as some 3x3 box that's been trimmed to shape, and then the ends can get closed off so they won't become cavities for water and dirt to collect later. Some very out-of-focus drilling was needed next, followed by a quick cleanup. And the last steps are to fuse in some captive nuts and finish them off with a set of 1/4-inch rubber isolator blocks like we're using everywhere else. With them fitted in place and just tacked for now, that gets the first set of mounts crossed off the list, and we can change course to the last step for today, which is the driveshaft. Or lack of one, more correctly. And to do that, we need to start with the rear yoke. That's missing 2. Ah, there it is. You might be able to tell 2 of the bolts have inconveniently broken off below the surface and need to be extracted. Now, there's the possibility they just snapped from over-torquing, so let's get some penetrating oil in there and give them a shot with an easy out. A small hole is drilled square to the bolt first, and then we can fight for far too long before realizing that our attempts are simply in vain. They're just too rusted to get them out this way, and the usual next step would be to weld on a nut. But seeing as the whole yoke is cast iron, I am a bit concerned about melting it all together, which wouldn't exactly help. So instead, we opted to drill them out the rest of the way and tap them, which yet again didn't exactly work. See, the holes weren't perfectly centered, and the new threads ended up crossing over the old ones, resulting in a pretty weak repair. But by the magical powers of editing and research, we've now got this new replacement, or rather upgrade, as this one uses U-bolts, which are not only stronger than the strap-style retainers they replace, but also use nuts on the backside, so there is 0 chance of them ever rusting in place again. So, with that little chestnut sorted, let's actually get on with the driveshaft. But of course, before that we need to make room for the driveshaft. See, the transmission tunnel was one of the few remaining pieces of the original floor, and we'd have kept it if that depression wasn't completely in the way. I have to point out, these cuts were eyeballed to the extreme, as we are only concentrating on getting material out of the way for now. But with it removed, this will have also made sizing and fitting the driveshaft way more convenient. Clearly visible now, our T5 gearbox output shaft has 28 splines, just like every other Ford T5 ever made. However, as mentioned, I am a bit OCD and wanted to make sure we were buying the correct slip yoke before waving any money around. For some reason, my measurements showed a difference in size from what I was expecting. So thankfully, our local driveline shop lent us a yoke to clarify the issue, and sure enough, I was wrong. Everything fits fine, and at least it only killed a week of research. The yoke gets slid on 3/4 of an inch short of being fully engaged to allow for installation but not movement of the driveshaft, as because we have independent rear suspension, there's no live axle moving up and down to account for. After going over torque capacity, U-joint sizing, and a plethora of other small details with the builders, the custom driveshaft was ordered, and quite honestly, it's a lot longer than I was originally expecting. At 23 inches, it's almost 2 feet, which would be 609.9 millimeters, and that's more than half a yard, which may as well be a meter. Crazy! This is one of the first brand new parts of the drivetrain, and with any luck, we did our measuring correctly, and it will slot straight in.
And that's one of the smaller holes we've made.
Just have to be a little careful on these sides. Never really came back to clean them up. There we go. That's in.
Do you know what this means? I mean, do you really know what this means? It means the whole darn drivetrain is actually together. From the engine, through the clutch, flywheel, and custom starter solution, to the transmission, out the driveshaft to the rear end, through the axles, and to the wheels. Insane. I've had all this in my mind for well over a year at this point, so to see it together is just so exciting. I really think you're going to enjoy what's next. So if you haven't yet, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell some friends. A huge thank you to our amazing patrons and donators for their continued support, and if you'd like to help contribute, please check out the links below. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Fanatik Builds, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.